analysis workshop. The second part of this workshop will actually take place next week, and that's going to be on Thursday, April 28th at 3 p.m., so the same time. And today we're very excited to welcome Dr. Hannah Kim and Dr. Stephen Kintz, who will be conducting the core lexicon analysis workshop. So we're looking forward to learning a lot more on this topic today. Audience members, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can unmute yourselves and ask the questions. And finally, if anybody needs a letter of attendance for today, please email Dr. Brielle Stark, and her email will be in the chat. So you can email and we're happy to provide a letter of attendance. All right, well, thank you everybody again for joining in, and I will let Dr. Kim take it from here.
Great, thank you for having us today. We are very excited about this workshop. I'm Hannah Kim from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. And this is...
I'm Stephen Kintz from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock.
Okay, I'm moving on to the next slide. Okay, we separated this workshop into two sessions. For day one, we are going to tell you more about the background of core lexicon measures and how the idea of core lexicon measures arose and what the main purpose of core lexicon measures are. And we'll also introduce you to studies pertaining to the validity and the application of this measure. Okay, before going into the details of our research, I would like to briefly talk about why discourse and discourse assessment are important. So in most cases, persons with aphasia and their family members' ultimate goal of treatment is to improve their ability to communicate with others, which has immediate relevance to discourse level language performance. So the discourse is defined as any language that is beyond the isolated sentences. So why do discourse and discourse assessment matter to clinicians? Discourse is an objective method for evaluating how well the individual can communicate with others. And also, changes in discourse production can be used to evaluate meaningful changes in response to treatment. Although clinicians generally understand the importance of discourse assessment, they hardly administer discourse level assessment in clinical settings for practical reasons, such as a lack of time or resource-heavy preparatory work. So instead of using discourse level assessment, clinicians tend to use comprehension naming tasks, trying to draw inferences about patients' communicative ability. However, using comprehension naming tasks as a proxy measure is a flawed approach, and that does not predict discourse level performance based on previous studies. So let's talk about what clinicians face to evaluate discourse production in their practices. So the very first thing that they have to do is to collect language samples and transcribe the samples, and then we have to decide which measure you're going to use and then score the language samples. So I try to make this figure as simple as possible. However, there are many hidden clinical decisions behind this scene. So let's get to more details. So when we collect language, we should think about what discourse tasks you will be using, and discourse task that you chose is proper enough to elicit good quality and good quantity of samples. And when it comes to transcription process, is your transcription accurate? And are there any other errors or typos in your transcriptions? Also, in reality, how much time can you spend in transcribing language samples? In terms of selecting a discourse level measure, you should think about whether the discourse measure that you pick was thoroughly validated in research, or whether the measure that you pick was sensitive enough to capture deficits in your client's language. And finally, we'll get to the last stage for scoring. The training to master the rules of scoring is very complicated. So it'll definitely take so much time to learn about how to score. And even with a lot of time for training, are you sure that you know really well about the rules for scoring? And are you confident with the scoring system? When you're done with the scoring, what does this number mean to you? So knowing these clinical barriers for discourse analysis, researchers recently have developed a lexicon-based analysis that does not require time and resource-heavy processes, which is core lexicon measure. So core lexicon is defined as critical lexical items necessary to produce a semantically meaningful and coherent narratives. So for example, when you're asked to tell the Cinderella story, what kinds of words would you say to deliver the main theme of the Cinderella story? I know you guys are muted, so I just answer it by myself. So you need to produce some words: Cinderella, or stepmother, stepsisters, and prince, those main characters. And as an example of verbs, you may need to produce the verb go to describe the scene of the Cinderella going to the ball. So those words that I just mentioned that are required to be produced to build the Cinderella story become core lexicons. So depending on discourse tasks, different core lexicon measures are needed. So here you can see the core lexicon checklists that have been developed and investigated by many researchers. So if there's anything else that we missed in the slide, and please just mention it in the chat box so that everyone can have the most updated information. There is a compendium of core lexicon measure checklist that was published 2020, which includes the checklist of the Cinderella story, peanut butter and jelly sandwich, broken window, refused umbrella, cat rescue, and 2 wordless picture books. So we are planning to share the reference with you during the day 2 workshop. I'll touch on other core lexicon checklists developed by other researchers later, but right now I'll focus on checklists that my group have developed using wordless picture books. So we have large normative data for specific discourse tasks. So we've been able to develop core lexicon measures using the data. So here is the snapshot of normative data in terms of their age, education, and gender distribution. So we use 2 wordless picture books as discourse stimuli, Guitar Car and Picnic, each having approximately 20 to 25 pages. The 25 most frequently produced verbs, nouns, adjectives, adverbs, and function words were determined and included in core lexicon measures by 7 different age groups. The Guitar Car story illustrates the events that occur when a dog is left to take care of a baby. So Guitar Car story follows a temporal story structure and includes numerous details to the story. And Picnic is a story about a family of mice going on a picnic. The picnic is considered a more complex story structure as it is sequentially and temporally driven. So those 2 stories present with different story structure formats, such as settings and the problems. I've got an example of the Guitar Car storybook here. So here's the Guitar Car storybooks. The first page of the book provides a setting with a mom's request to the dog Carl. So when the mom leaves, the baby comes out of the crib and plays with the dog, and they get into the mom's makeup and they make a little bit of a mess. And the baby plays in the fish tank with the dog. However, by the time the mom comes back, everything is back to where it is supposed to be. So the mom doesn't know all the things that happened, and she says Guitar Car. So here you can see the 25 most frequently produced words from the 60s age group. This is the words that they use mainly to describe the good dog car story. So due to the size of the slide, you only can see the top 15 words on this slide. And this slide has the remaining 10 words that couldn't fit on the previous slide. Interestingly, those in 60s produced the word aquarium to describe the scene of the baby swimming, but the people in their 20s used fish tank instead of aquarium. So you won't see that word aquarium in the checklist for the 20s age group. So again, this is a brief map of how our core lexicon checklists are constructed. Each story task has 7 different sets of core lexicon checklists by age, and each consisting of 5 word classes: nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and function words. As I mentioned earlier, simple rules for scoring is a key benefit of using core lexicon metrics. So here is the detailed guidelines providing 3 rules to remember. So we do not count synonyms of core lexicon items, but count noun plurals, verb conjugation, and inflections. And only 1 point is given, regardless of how many times each core lexicon item may have been produced by a speaker. So I know it may be a little bit difficult to imagine what it looks like and how to use from a clinician's perspective. So let's imagine you have a patient who is 63 years old. So you can check her age and bring checklist of 60s age group, and giving her a wordless picture book with instructions. So for example, please look through the book and get an idea of the story. Then you start at the beginning and tell me the story that goes with the pictures. So here is a language sample from one of our speakers with aphasia. So this is a dog watching over a baby. He takes him into the room and lets him play on the bed. He takes the laundry room and the dog runs down and grabs him. So now all you should do is counting the words produced by this patient. So based on these 2 sentences, she scored 5 out of 25. So we believe that it can be scored with a recorded file, or once clinicians are familiar with checklists consisting of core lexicon items, this may be done online. So keeping the concept of core lexicon measures in your mind, let's move on to our research. The purpose of the study was to determine how well core lexicon checklists measure overall aphasia severity. So our research question was, do core lexicon scores on wordless picture books significantly correlate with aphasia severity as determined by Western Aphasia Variety aphasia quotient? In the study 1, we focused on developing core content word checklists for nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. And later we developed core function word checklists, and then they were investigated in a subsequent study. So here is the demographic information for 11 persons with aphasia, consisting of 5 fluent types and 6 non-fluent types of aphasia. Due to the small number of sample size, we ran Spearman's correlation coefficients. Looking at those graphs, high correlations between aphasia severity and core verb production was found. This indicates that as overall aphasia severity increases, fewer core verb production, fewer core verbs were produced. So this finding was interesting, but not as surprising, because the verbs are generally considered the building blocks or central themes of utterances. In the second study, significant correlations were found between core function word production and overall aphasia severity. This indicates that as aphasia severity increases, fewer core function words were produced. So this is a particularly interesting point because we did not discriminate proper use of core function words in their language samples. And we simply count if the core function words were present or not in their language samples. So here is a quick summary of those two studies. For verbs and function words, they may be useful for determining a typical patterns of lexical usage in discourse production, which in turn is reflective of aphasia severity. As you remember, we have 5 different core lexicon checklists by word classes. So what about the other word classes? We did not find any correlations between other word classes and aphasia severity. So indicating that other word classes are restricted to providing clinical information. However, given that the discourse disruptions featured in persons with aphasia lie on the continuum of normal performance, we can still gain some insight into the nature of persons with aphasia's language profiles. So building off the previous studies, we extended the application of core lexicon measures by demonstrating concurrent validity. So our research question was, do core lexicon scores on word list picture books correlate with performance on other linguistic measures? To explore concurrent validity of core lexicon measures, we included macrolinguistic measures. Macrolinguistic measures include coherence thematic units. So they refer to how well discourse units maintain the overall themes. So we also include the microlinguistic measures, syntactic complexity, information unit, lexical diversity. So if you want to know more about those measures, and I'm happy to answer it later. So now I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit to interpret these results. So multiple correlations between core lexicon measures and micro and macro linguistic measures were found. Significant correlations were found between macrolinguistic measures and core nouns. These indicate that producing core nouns results in more coherent discourses. We also found negative correlations between core adverbs and information units and lexical diversity. Just thinking about how we scored core lexicon measures. We did not check the proper use of adverbs and simply checking the presence and absence of lexical items. So presumably the methodological approach of core lexicon measures is unlikely to be suitable for quantifying adverb production in discourse for this good dog car story. A significant correlation was found between core function word production and syntactic complexity. So this is not that surprising because function word production at the discourse level is associated with elaborative sentence structure. For the picnic story, core verbs and nouns significantly correlated with syntactic complexity. The dependent clauses are embedded within an utterance and include content words that are likely verbs and nouns. For core adjectives, we found correlations between core adjective production and information units and lexical diversity. So this finding is not that easy to interpret these results because adjectives rarely received attention in aphasia study so far. So, however, in the field of linguistics, it has been suggested that adjectives serve as a measure to quantify language proficiency. So this doesn't make sense that core adjectives results in greater lexical diversity and information units. Given the findings of good dog car and lack of finding with picnic, at this point, we are less interested in using core adverb checklist. For function words, we found significant correlations with micro and macro linguistic measures. This indicates that more production of core function words results in not only producing more elaborative sentence structures, but also results in more coherent discourses. So results were promising because they provide additional empirical support for potential use of core lexicon measures. So core lexicon measures were found to be highly informative, even with some inconsistent findings by story. So what the results indicate is increases in core nouns can result in more coherent discourse samples, and greater production of core verbs and function words can contribute to more syntactic complexity in the utterance. So now my colleague, Dr. Kins, will be presenting other studies using different core lexicon checklists developed based on other discourse tasks.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. So Dr. Kim was basically discussing core lexicon lists, the core lexical items needed to tell a story. And we had all divided it by age. And this was, of course, because we found it necessary. And one example of why it was necessary is because when we created the core lexicon list for like wordless picture books, the 80-year-olds and the 50-year-olds only had about 50% of the same nouns. So 50% of the nouns for core lexicon were different. However, when we look at what we call more restricted discourse samples or shorter discourse samples like cookie theft or cat rescue, we don't see age being as large of a factor. This is also true for lexical diversity. Procedural discourse, single picture descriptions have a lower lexical diversity or a more restricted vocabulary than wordless picture books or even like free conversation. So when we're looking at, from here on out, we're looking at basically single pictures and procedural discourse. And so the list will not be corrected by age. And we even seen that with single pictures and procedural discourse, age corrected lists are no more predictive than lists not corrected by age. We will also, of course, from Dr. Kim was mainly talking about Good Dog Carl and Picnic, which are wordless picture books that not a lot of researchers currently use, though we do highly recommend using them. They provide long, good samples usually. So we decided to see if core lexicon could also be used for more common items like cat rescue, cookie theft, or the procedural discourse, how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So for study 4, we looked specifically at sandwich and cat rescue. We created the core lexicon list based off that same 400 sample, or 400 plus control sample that we used for the wordless picture books. But instead of having the 25 most frequent items, because they are shorter discourse samples, by the time you get to noun 25 or verb 25, not a lot of people are actually using it. So we actually changed the criteria to be at least 50% of the control participants had to produce the word. And so that's how we created the core lexicon list for this. The rest of the data is going to come from aphasia bank. And so for study 4, we just wanted to determine whether core lexicon scores for procedural and single picture discourse tasks correlate with basically standardized and non-standardized measures. For the standardized measures, we use the Western Aphasia Battery, Boston Naming Test, and the Verb Naming Test that's available for all the data on Aphasia Bank. For the non-standard measures, we actually use words per minute and propositional density. These are both measures of kind of fluency. But they are also, of course, measures of discourse quality. We'll see soon that core lexicon is probably more related to informativeness. So this is cat rescue. You can see the different nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs produced. As you can see, because of the limited sample size, there is a limited number of verbs, adjectives, and adverbs for cat rescue. If you go to sandwich, you see the same thing. There are not a lot of words that people, or more than 50% of the, oh, is something going wrong?
No, I think you're fine.
we're good now.
You're fine.
Okay,
yeah.
I'm sorry. You can see that once again, we have restricted adjective adverb use simply because there's more restricted vocabulary when using sandwich or cat rescue. When we look at the study, on the next slide, we can see that we actually had moderate to strong correlations with things like the Western aphasia battery and the core lexicon scores. We also see, so it's even the smaller discourse samples are very good at telling us the severity of the person with aphasia. And we can see here that cat rescue seems to be a better at determining severity than sandwich. However, when it comes to the different types of standardized measures we used, Boston naming test actually had the lowest correlation for both cat rescue and sandwich. This actually makes sense because Boston naming test also correlates less strongly with discourse ability than either the WOB or usually verb naming test. When we go to, of course, the non-standardized measures, which once again are kind of fluency measures, though fluency is highly related to informativeness. If you're being fluent, you have to be informative. You can see once again, there are decent sized correlations for cat rescue, moderate correlations, and some weaker correlations for sandwich. Once again, the single picture cat rescue might be a better way to collect discourse than procedural discourse. But these measures show that core lexicon is letting us know something about the quality of discourse. And they're probably very related to informativeness. So this is just a recap. So far, we've had studies that show that core lexicon scores correlate with aphasia severity for wordless picture books, single picture descriptions, and procedural discourse. When we look at core lexicon with non-standardized measures, once again, they also correlate very well: coherence, thematic units, syntactic complexity, and lexical diversity. And what we also see is, once again, other research agrees with us. So if we look at other studies that weren't done by either myself or Dr. Kim, we can see that for Aoyehaya et al. 2021, she looked at the cookie theft and dinner party. Dinner party is actually on the screen there because it's not as commonly used among people who study aphasia. But she was basically looking at correct information units, and correct information units is definitely a measure of informativeness. And she got extremely high correlations. Now, there was one difference between how she created core lexicon list and we did. She did the percentage method where she required 75% of all the control participants to say a word to be included on the core lexicon list. But as you can see, there were strong correlations. In fact, the correlations were strong enough that the researcher was comfortable producing linear models that allow a person to take the core lexicon score and convert it into CIUs. Now, why this might be useful is because CIUs are way more common than core lexicon currently. And there's a lot more data about how to interpret CIUs than there are for core lexicon. However, CIUs are more difficult to score and get a correct score, basically. Core lexicon can be done online, and it's often very fast. So core lexicon is easier to collect, but it might be telling us pretty much the same information as CIUs. We see this with another study done by Dalton and Richardson in 2015, where they took core lexicon for the cookie theft picture, and they were looking to see if it basically related to main concepts, another measure of informativeness. And again, we see moderate to actually very strong correlations. For conduction and people who are no longer aphasic as determined by the WOB have the lowest correlations. This actually may be related to the fact that cookie theft gives a restricted language sample. It's not very long. We might have seen more issues with we might have seen a better correlation if maybe it was a longer language sample. However, we can see that it does relate not just to those standardized measures that let us know severity, it relates to measures of discourse quality. We also wanted to determine whether or not core lexicon scores can detect change over time, because that's when it becomes particularly useful for clinicians. And so for study 5, this was a longitudinal study where 19 people with aphasia within 1 week of their stroke were tested. They were given the cookie theft to produce a discourse sample, and they were given the Boston naming test as well as the Hopkins action naming test. For those who aren't familiar with the Hopkins action naming test, it's a 30-item test, just like the Boston naming test short form, with basically drawings that depict actions. It has the same frequency for each item as the Boston naming test. So it's very good to be able to compare between the two. But what we were doing is we were just seeing whether or not for all 19 people of aphasia, whether or not you could find changes in the Boston naming test and the Hopkins action naming test, and whether we would see those same changes for the core lexicon scores. Next slide, thank you. So here you can see we have the 19 participants with aphasia. You can see that a lot of the people have anomic aphasia, so they don't have a very strong severity, or they don't have a severe problem. And of course, this makes it difficult to often track their change. On the next few slides, we're going to look at A3 and A17 as ones we're going to pay close attention to. So this is on the left, you see the measurements of the Boston naming test, and on the right is the Hopkins action naming test. For the Boston naming test, or for both of these, about 6 out of 19 people saw either no change on the Boston naming test or the Hopkins action naming test between time 1 or time 2, and 1 person even showed a decline between Boston naming test, the HANA test, as well as the core lexicon. That's going to be A3. But if you look at A17, that's the black line. And we're doing this to illustrate how 5 of the 19 people with aphasia didn't show any change with Boston naming or the Hopkins action naming test. And you can see that with the black line, where it stays around 50% for the Boston naming test. And it goes actually a little bit declining for the Hopkins action naming test. However, when we look at the next slide, things change. So on the next slide, we have the core lexicon score. And while 5 of the 6 individuals with aphasia didn't show changes on the Boston naming or the Hopkins action naming test, they did show changes on the core lexicon measure. And if you look there at the black line again, the black line basically has it going from around 20% all the way up to almost 60%. So we're detecting a change with core lexicon that we're not able to detect with those standardized measures. Now, if we look at A3, which is that kind of tan color, unfortunately, A3 still had a decline in core lexicon from time 1 to time 2. They also declined with the Boston naming test and the Hopkins action naming test. We believed that this person had vascular or some type of mild cognitive impairment issues that were complicating the test. So they might not have just had like a pure aphasia or just presenting with aphasia. So for study 5, just to recap, is basically that core lexicon does seem sensitive enough to document language change over multiple instances. And this, of course, is very valuable to clinicians because they can not only use it to assess people for their severity, but for their discourse quality. They can also use it to track change over time, which is, of course, what we want any assessment to be able to do. These, of course, are just our conclusions. So for this presentation, we've seen that core lexicon scores correlate very strongly, whether wordless picture books or the single picture descriptions, with some of the standardized measures, the Western Aphasia Battery, aphasia quotient being the most common. We've also seen it correlate with non-standardized measures of discourse quality, especially when it's related to informativeness. So we have the thematic units, the main units, the CIUs, all of those correlated very strongly with the core lexicon scores. And of course, core lexicon scores, as demonstrated by study 5, can measure subtle language changes. In fact, they are probably more subtle than can be measured by the Boston naming test or the Hopkins action naming test. Now, of course, there is more research needed. We need to, of course, reduce the list size for the wordless picture books. 25 verbs is going to be very hard to score, especially if you're also scoring 25 nouns. We, of course, need more clinical testing, and eventually we're going to need some normative data so that interpretation is easier. And of course, for day 2, we're going to actually talk about some more of the development, because there are different ways you can develop these lists and they get slightly different results. We're going to talk about the reliability. So how reliable you can score these, it's pretty reliable. And then we're even going to give you some practice. So we have 3 stories, and you're basically going to be given the opportunity to try to score their core lexicon. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, which I think I saw some on the chat, we would be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation and really good overview of core lexicon analysis. Yes, there are questions coming in, and I'm happy to read them out to both of you. Dr. Leora Turney says, I may have missed this, but for this study and the prior ones, are there differences in the relationship of core lexicon with aphasia based on the type of aphasia?
Yeah, I can ask that question. I can answer that question. So the wordless picture book study, we looked at the differences between the fluent and non-fluent types of aphasia. And we found a significant difference between those 2 groups in terms of the production of core verbs and function words. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, can I just follow up with that? Is that okay?
Sure.
Of course.
Yeah. So what were the differences? I mean, so some, if we're thinking about core lex as being informational content, we think about somebody like a Wernicke's aphasic, maybe not having a lot of information, and a Broca's aphasic being able to, produce a lot of single words, maybe not so many verbs. I mean, is there a way that core lex can help differentiate type of aphasia, maybe even in a better way than the WAB, helps us differentiate type of aphasia?
Yeah, so in the papers, we actually use aphasia quotient and their classification based on the WAP testing, because, well, we wanted to use a standardized test to see the classification of those patients. And as you just mentioned, those fluent types of aphasia, they perform better on the production of verbs and core verbs and then function words compared to those with the non-fluent types of aphasia. So we believe that potentially it will be helpful for clinicians to differentiate those two different types of aphasia. But because we had pretty small number of participants, we did not look at this by subtype. So we only compare the fluent and non-fluent types of aphasia, but did not look at each subtype and how they perform differentially in the core lexicon measures.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Next question is by Dr. Stacy Raymer. She says, in your picture books, have you looked at the length of a speech sample needed to correlate with core lexicon measures? And she also says, this is such great and clinically helpful work.
No.
Yeah,
Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Then as currently, we haven't really looked at much of the how long the speech sample needs to be. But from the research that we've been looking at, it seems to be that the longer the sample is, of course, the more information you get, the better the information usually correlates. So I almost take it like a look at it because we have so much more information on lexical diversity. If the discourse type has low lexical diversity, like the procedural discourse often has the lowest, we see that that has, at least in Dr. Kim and my research, the lowest correlations. And those ones that have like higher lexical diversity scores, generally like wordless picture books, or sequential pictures, their core lexicon measures correlate better with severity and measures of discourse quality. But we haven't specifically looked at how many words you actually need yet. That is one of the many things that need to be done with this before it's completely clinically useful for a wide range of clinicians.
Thank you. Dr. Stark asks, what are your thoughts on incorporating nonverbal information into core lexicon? For example, is there a future study that could look at gestures and whether they satisfied hitting the core lexicon? Of course, this isn't just speech, but looking at communication overall.
Yeah, thank you for questioning that interesting things, Bree. Well, I'm personally interested in looking at the gestures and its relationship with the discourse production, but currently there's no study like from my side working on, looking at those relationships, but that could be really great, like future study. So I know, well, you are interested in looking at the gestures because I saw a couple of papers that you published recently. So that could be really great study for, yeah, the core lexicon.
Yeah, I think we would both quite enjoy doing something like that because when I first started working with core lexicon, we initially were considering using synonyms and other things. So coming up with the most common synonyms people use to create the list, which isn't quite as different as gestures, but one of the reasons we didn't do that simply is because it complicated things so much. So it just made the scoring a lot more difficult for people. And so it was dropped before any of the real research went into it. But I think gestures would be great to include because there's a lot of gestures that communicate just as much information as like the verb. So that would be a great future study.
That's excellent. I was also thinking, I've observed this in a lot of patients where, they definitely use and, express using gestures, but also use other modalities, and they're correct. They might draw, they might write the first letter and letters, and they're correct actually about the main concept about the story. So this would be something interesting to look at in the future. Dr. Raymer has another question. Can you tell us a bit about how adults across ages reacted to these picture books? It's tricky avoiding stories that are a bit childish.
Well, I can answer the question.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Dr. Raymer. Yeah, we've got this question many times, honestly, and they're worrying about, the older adults, they feel a little bit offended having those childish storybooks to tell the story. But telling the story, like making the story based on those pictures is actually part of their life. They all have this experience in describing pictures or making a story for their child or their grandkids. So none of them really feel offended, and they were actually enjoying making the stories.
Yeah, I've generally found that using the wordless picture books, if you're going to have a problem with somebody, it's going to be younger adults, just because they're often more self-conscious about it being a child's story. So I'll see that in like very young, but usually by 30, and definitely by the time they're in their 80s, they don't have any problem with it. They often seem to enjoy it. And a lot of people talk about, oh, I used to do this with my grandchildren, or I do this with my grandchildren. So it's actually something that a lot of people have come to enjoy when we test them.
That's great. Dr. Tierney has another question. To develop core Lex for a specific stimulus item, what do you think is the minimum number of normative samples we should have? Might be different for different kinds of discourse.
Want to go?
Well, Stephen, do you want to answer it?
Yes. So one of the studies, I forgot who it was, but one of the studies I believe used a normative sample of 20 individuals, and they still got pretty good correlations. So it can be as minimum as like 20 to 50 people, and you can still get it. However, I would caution that the longer the discourse sample is, or the more diverse the vocabulary appears to be, the more individuals you're going to need. Because if we just use 20 people for like the wordless picture books, I can find 20 people who might not use very many nouns at all overlapping. So the longer the sample is going to be, the more diverse that vocabulary is going to be, the bigger the sample. Then I would want at least 100 people probably. But once again, we haven't directly tested that.
Great. Dr. Stark has another question. She says, sorry if I missed this earlier. How does the interpretation differ for the following: total number of core Lex items produced, and also the percentage of core Lex items produced out of the total possible that could have been produced? She says this is like the CIU versus percent CIU idea, and may take into account sample length to some extent, as well as some of the other things like lexical diversity. Have you looked at how these two interpretations differ, or what they might individually tell us? Also, of course, things like core lexicon per minute.
I can answer the question. So the reason that we use the percentage of core lexicon items produced is that the 100%, that 100, the total score, that is more intuitive for clinicians. They're just accustomed to using that, the 100 score, and then it would be maybe easier for them to figure out where this participant's performance lie on the continuum of the normal processing. So that was actually one of the simple reasons that we tried to use it. And Stephen, do you want to add more?
Yeah, so now I've considered looking at core lexicon a minute, but we have not done that yet. When it comes to the total number of core lexical items produced versus the percentage, because it's a restricted list, like you have 25 items, you're going to get very specific percentages. And if you use more than the 25 items, you don't get more than like a 25 score. So I pretty much always, when I'm writing a paper, I run the numbers, the raw numbers, so the total core lexicon items and the percent. I have yet to get any difference in like the results from that, just because I think of how the lists are constructed. That doesn't seem to matter, but we use the percentage as Dr. Kim said. It's just more intuitive to understand than, oh, they used 50% of the items, or they used 12 items. We don't know about core lexicon a minute, so almost a measure of fluency, like propositions per minute or proposition density. That would be a very interesting question.
Great, thank you. She also adds, I would think someone producing 3 core lex, all of which for the same item versus 20% core lexicon items, which is more core lexicon items, would be interpreted very differently.
Stephen, do you want to answer or?
Well, I imagine it would be interpreted differently, but the way we currently score it, if I'm understanding you, if they used 3 core lexical items, which were all the same, they would still only get a 1 for the core lexicon score. So if they use dog 3 times and that's a core lexical item, they still only get that 1 point. So they wouldn't, so the percentage would technically be the same if you divide like 1 by 25, whatever that is, as then if they just got whatever that percentage is. Yes, we don't know how repetitions affect it yet. So yes, yeah.
Perfect. I also had a follow-up question about, the words that they do produce but are not in the checklist. I was just curious about how you handle those words that, are still adding to the informativeness, but are not necessarily mentioned in the checklist, I believe. Dr. Kim, the example that you showed, the individual produced maybe 6 verbs, but the core lexicon had 5. So I was just wondering how you would handle that from a clinical perspective.
Can you just repeat it once again? Because you were just caught maybe because of my internet signals.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. I was just saying, how do you handle the additional items that the patient might produce, which are not necessarily mentioned in the checklist?
Oh, so well, we only care about those items included in the checklist. And when patients produce some other words or synonyms, they are not counted for the score.
Okay.
It actually might be very interesting to look at, which is something we hadn't considered yet, but look at how much information isn't included in that core lexicon and how much information is and what percentage of their sample that is. That might actually tell us some interesting things.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking. Thank
That might
you.
even help find out whether they have like Wernicke's aphasia to another type, because they'll be more likely to add that useless information. Yeah, no, that's a very interesting question. I like that one. Thank you.
Yeah. So core lexicon measures is in its early stage of the development and the application of the measure. So still there's a long way to go to refine this measure.
Yeah.
But this is a great start. I appreciate all the work that's going into this. Because it's very clinically relevant, and also something I'm sure you are thinking about is developing these checklists for languages other than English, because I have seen the lexical items vary depending on the language. So I think that would something be of interest in later in the future.
Yeah, definitely. So as an international scientist, I'm really interested in looking at those difference in the production of vocabulary items in different populations. So for example, myself, when I looked at the guitar car, it was a picnic story. So the family of mice going on a picnic and they play the baseball, and there is a mouse playing banjo. So when I looked at the picture first time, I said that it's a guitar, not the banjo, because banjo is pretty unique. It's not really common in South Korea. So definitely, if you're targeting different populations with various linguistic and cultural backgrounds, you have to collect normative data again, and then develop the whole new task based on their normative samples.
And I mean, I would even caution that different dialects of English, different areas of America might use very different words. Most of the sample that we have, like those 470, come from the southern United States, either Kentucky, Arizona, but not like Northeast. So it would be very interesting to see how different dialects and different cultures with even the same language, definitely outside the language, is going to be vastly different. But I imagine it would be different there. That's probably one of the weaker aspects of this, is just because it's semantic in nature, looking at words, culture is going to have a huge impact on it.
There's a lot of potential for research, so that's great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much again. If there are no more questions, we can end the recording here. And thank you again for joining in. Just as a reminder, the second part of this workshop will take place next week on Thursday at the same time, which is 3 p.m. Eastern time. We'll see you again next week.